Mr. TG. This is lesson 11.7 on samples and surveys, Algebra 2B. Today's lesson is on samples and surveys, and the first thing we're going to define for you are four ways in which we can collect a sample. What we're doing here is showing you different ways of studying a large population, and obviously we're not capable of doing that, so we collect a sample of the population and study that and make some conclusions based on that sample about the whole population. There are four ways in which you can do this. The first way is called a random sample. When each member of the population is equally likely to be chosen for your sample. So an example of this would be randomly selecting someone from Forest Lake to perform in your sample, and then as a result studying that data. Self-selected sample is when people have to take some form of action to be a part of the sample. In other words, you put something maybe in the paper and say, call in and let us know how you feel about this. That would be a self-selected sample. A convenience sample would be if you're sitting at a location just interviewing in your sample certain people that are coming in that location. Or if I did a sample in my classroom, that's a convenience sample because you are there, and it's just, as it says, it's convenient for me to take it. A systematic sample is when we order the population in some way and then select from that order in regular intervals. So we may take the first 5 and then the next, skip the next 10 and then take the next 5. But it's just a way of taking part of the population out, studying the results, which is what we call a sample, and then trying to make some generalizations on what the large population is like. The best example I can think of for this would be your voting. When there's an election, they predict who the winner is going to be based on samplings or samples. And they're very good at picking certain samples that will give them an idea of who's going to win the election. And that's how they predict the elections. Now, when we gather the information with our sample, these are ways we can collect the information. The first way is through an observed study. You measure or observe members of a sample in a way that will not affect the study. So you're on the outside looking in, just observing them. You could perform a controlled experiment, which means you set up, in this case, 2 groups, and you impose a treatment on one group and not the other. Then you compare the effect on the treated group and compare it to the non-treated group. Or you can just do a survey, give each person a survey to complete, and then use that in your sample. Now, what I'd like to have you do, and this is the first part of this lesson, is simply go through the examples listed at the bottom of your notes. There's 4 of them. Identify what type of sample was being used here, and then are there any bias? Now, a bias simply means that are we trying to persuade the people that we are interviewing, or either intentionally and not intentionally, are we trying to persuade them to say something or basically vote a certain way? So think about what the bias might be for problems 1 through 4, and then tell me what kind of sample they are using. So I'll give you a moment to do that, and then fill in your results, and then we'll check our answers. Okay, welcome back. Here's, as you can see, I put the different ways in which the sample was gathered here. Number 1 says the viewers of a heavy metal music hour are asked to call in and name their favorite artist. This would be considered a self-selected sample. Somebody actually has to take action to participate. Biased on this, obviously you're just going to get the people that like heavy metal music as input, and that may bias your results depending on what you're surveying. Number 2, the school newspaper interviews the first 100 people to enter the school in a given morning. That would be a convenience sample. You're sitting in one location interviewing the first 100 people to enter the school. Depending on how this is set up, it could be biased. If you, let's say, stood in front of the Forest Lake High School and did it during when the buses were coming off, you would only get a certain grade level because most kids that are in 10th or 11th grade ride the bus. You wouldn't get any type of input from probably seniors that drive the school. That's just an example of a bias that could come out of this. And number 3, a magazine asks its readers to fill out and send in a questionnaire. Again, self-selected sample. There's potential biases there. depending on what kind of magazine it is. And then 4, a survey service calls every 50th listing from a local phone booth. The survey wants to know how many people favor property tax increases to raise money for public parks. That's definitely a random sample. We're randomly selecting it. I think that's the best way to collect a sample, and it's the least biased. So hopefully after this first part of the lesson, you know what a sample is. We're essentially just observing a smaller part of the population to help us make conclusions about the large population. And then the thing when you do that, you got to make sure that you do not create any type of bias, and the questioning is important also. So what you're going to need to do is make sure you go in your books and read page 720. And in that page, on that page, it talks about things not to ask and things not to put in your questions, along with a good example, a couple examples. So page 720, I'd like you to read through that. And what I want you to do in your notes is make a list of things you should not put in your questions. And they're listed at the top of page 720. All right, thanks for viewing. Now the second video will be given to you by Pearson's, and it's essentially telling you how to calculate the margin of error. Anytime we do a sample, there's a certain degree of error, and there's actually a mathematical formula that will allow you to find that margin of error when performing a certain sample size and doing a sample. So good luck with that, and let me know if you have any questions.